Thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll get started in here in just a second. Sorry for being a couple minutes late.
And let's see
here. One second, James. I'll introduce you. So hello, everybody, and welcome to our Missouri Prairie Foundation webinar, Notes from the Underground, Ants in the Prairie with Dr. James Trager. So my name is Brooke Widmar. I'm the Director of Administrative Operations and Member Engagement for the Foundation. And I want to take a moment to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon, even if it's a couple minutes late. So make sure to check out our lineup of masterclasses and free webinars. It's currently scheduled through the end of April. So you have some exciting topics this spring, and here pretty soon we'll be announcing some more for May and beyond. During today's presentation, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section on your Zoom screen. At the end, Carol will come on and read those out to James. This webinar is being recorded. A link will be shared with all of you tomorrow, along with resources mentioned during today's presentation and Q&A session. So to introduce today's speaker, Dr. James Trager, he has a graduate degree in entomology, specializing in ant research, but he's always been broadly interested in the natural history of terrestrial ecosystems. After a 10-year stint as a research entomologist in Florida, Brazil, and Argentina, family matters brought him to Missouri, and he found employment as the interpretive naturalist and ecological restoration biologist at Shaw Nature Reserve near St. Louis. And he worked there for 28 and a half years until he retired two summers ago, 2019, though he's been staying on as an instructor and volunteer in the restoration program. He's currently working on a guide to the approximately 150 species of Missouri ants. He is frequently interrupted by zooming off to entomology and other sorts of nature talks, even occasionally giving one himself. Lately, he has become enchanted with a granddaughter born in August, whom he hopes to influence as a student or at least a lover of nature. And he's definitely influenced a lot of folks with his love of nature. Just last year, in 2019, he had received the Missouri Prairie Foundation Award for Prairie Communicator. So you guys are in good hands with James today. So take it away, James, if you want to give a little more intro or intro this talk while we get the PowerPoint pulled up.
Right. Thank you for that introduction. You pretty much said it all. But yes, I have an inordinate fondness for ants. People who've worked with me in the at the nature reserve or been on one of my wildflower ID classes might have seen me suddenly get sidetracked by an interesting ant observation. So that's for real. I was just, when I was in graduate school back in the 70s, I knew the names of practically every ant scientist in the world. And now there are so many of them because first thing that happened was the Bert Holdubler and Edward O. Wilson's book on the ants came out in 1971, I believe it was. And suddenly there was this tremendous interest in people going into entomology programs to study ants. And and there are also extracurricular ant courses all around the world. I have participated 5 times in the California Academy of Sciences ant course, which brings in people from all over the world. It's been and also it occurs around the world, but I'm an instructor in the ones that occur in the United States. So I think it looks like we have my show up and ready to go. And I can begin if that's all right with you, Carol, Brooke, and everybody. Yes? Let's go to the first slide just for to show my title. That's back one. Or maybe I'll start on this one. How we doing, Carol?
Just fine, James. Just let me know when you want me to just say advance, when you want me to go to the next slide.
Oh, can you go back one? Hit the P button usually works to do that. But if not, let's not worry about it. Okay, well, so this is, I've been really interested in ants of grasslands, and particularly the tallgrass prairie. The tallgrass prairie is something that I was introduced to first in 1972 as an undergraduate in biology at Northern Illinois University, and I became fascinated with it, sort of having been brought up like most people at the time on trees. So here was this entirely herbaceous plant community, and I got interested in the insects of it as well, and other animals as well, and then proceeded to get my entomology degrees in specializing in ants. And after coming to St. Louis, I found out there was this wonderful reconstructed prairie at Shaw Nature Reserve, then Shaw Arboretum, and I was able to study ants. So that's a little bit more introduction of how I got into this thing. First thing I just wanted to point out is that there are some ants that are specifically tallgrass prairie endemics. That's this dark blue bar on the left-hand side. And one of the interesting things that you might note there is that it is, not surprisingly, the smallest component of the overall fauna. A lot of the prairie ants are shared with nearby communities such as savannas and even woodlands and human habitat. But the other thing that is that there are no endemics in the southern tallgrass prairie. Those ants there all live in other communities. So, so I refer to this as the glaciated prairies in reference to the tertiary ice cover. Okay, so moving along, I won't spend any more time on this. Let's go ahead, if we can. Excellent. So the roles of ants in the prairie. This is, I should mention, the way this talk is going to work is I'll do a few text slides, try not to spend too much time on them, and then I'll show you some pictures of ants doing stuff, most of which I took myself. Anyway, so soil engineers, that's the something that ants do wherever they burrow around in soil, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit. Ants in the prairie are maybe predators. Most of them have some level of predation in their behavioral repertoire, and but they're not very good at getting really hard-bodied things like beetles and such. They tend to focus on soft-bodied insects, larvae in particular, caterpillars and such. They are scavengers as well, particularly of dead insects and spiders. But a few of them will also visit dead vertebrates, such as a mouse or whatever. Now, here's an interesting thing that you might not have thought about. There are functional primary consumers. So in ecology, we talk about primary consumers and secondary consumers. Primary consumers are those which produce, which consume directly the products that plants make, whether it's their leaves or their roots or glandular secretions or their seeds. Those are primary consumers, and secondary consumers are animals that eat other animals, simply. So we'll talk a bit about that later on, and then I have a little ending part about plant community engineers, and that's different from soil engineers. Next slide, please. Okay, so as soil engineers, ants stir, aerate, and hydrate soil. So they tunnel into the soil, they bring subsoil up to the surface, and air and rainwater are able to penetrate. And I should mention whatever happens to be dissolved in the rainwater. There are often nutrients, minerals, and so on that are taken down with that rainwater. Ants themselves enrich soil because they import nutrients by way of their trash around their nests. And often they bury their trash underground and deposit their feces in you know, out of the way places of the underground nest, and that directly fertilizes prairie soil, any soil that ants live in. Ant nest materials have been studied pretty well regarding their nutrient content, and it's higher in ant nest materials than in surrounding soils, except in the immediate vicinity of the ant nests themselves. And finally, we'll, particularly in the glaciated prairie, ants build mounds, which, you know, are clearly physical structures out there in the prairie. Okay, next slide, please. Ah, there we are. So ants stir up a lot of soil during nest construction. This is particularly apparent in the spring and the early summer when the nests basically have to be rebuilt after they've collapsed with winter rains and the inactivity of the ants at that time. They can't actually move when they're cold. And so they get into this frenzy of nest reconstruction. This is the nest entrance of a tiny little ant. Actually, you can sort of see some in the entrance on the right-hand side there, but they're really small. They're jet black, and they're called amazingly little black ants in English because they sometimes enter buildings and so on. Most ants don't have a common name, but the ones that interact with human habitat in some way often are the ones that will. Anyway, so this is just the characteristic excavated soil that monomora minimum or little black ants have brought up from underground. Next, please. There's a little delay on the slide advancing. Anyway, I'll just mention while we're waiting for that next slide to come up, often ants have very characteristic ways of piling the soil particles around their nest entrance when they're doing this nest renovation. And there is a, you can sometimes know what ant you're looking at just by seeing the nest entrance without even actually looking at an ant specimen. I have turned off my video. Good suggestion. Okay. Anyway, this is a great picture from up in northwestern Missouri at the Dunn Ranch Prairie, which has some remnant prairie and some reconstructions. That's not a pristine prairie per se. Dunn Ranch has a long history of grazing, and some of that was to excess, and it degraded the prairie. And in fact, that probably has something to do with the extreme abundance of ant mounds. These things are about 10 feet apart. They're really close together. And this is one sort of big population of interacting colonies that sometimes exchange individuals among the nests and so on. And there aren't very many other kinds of ants that can live in this density of a moderately aggressive ant that the prairie mound ant or Formica montana happens to be. So, but these mounds about 2, sometimes 3 feet across at the base, and not quite that tall. The vegetation right next to them tends to be a little bit different from that in between them. Anyway, these guys are bringing a lot of soil up, mixing it with plant matter because they go out and gather like fragments of plants, and there's clearly some soil engineering going on. Some plants actually prefer to germinate on the ant nests. Next, please. This one we won't spend a lot of time on. This actually isn't from Missouri. This is a plaster cast of an ant nest in a sandhill grassland in northern Florida. So this was made by a species we don't have here, but prairie ants often do dig quite deep in the construction of their nests. Walter Chinkle, who's standing by this nest cast, is about he's over 6 feet tall. He's a colleague of mine, fellow instructor at ant course and so on. Anyway, here he has made a cast which was laboriously dug out after it was filled with this slurry of plaster, and it had to be a little bit glued together, and now it resides in a natural history museum. So yeah, Walter's done a lot of this. He's also made them with other materials. But this is a magnificent example. Next, please. I would just mention regarding that last slide that the underground structure of the nests differs among ants. They're not all identical. They don't all look like that with tubes and then larger rooms where the ants congregate. There are other ways that they can be structured. All right, moving on to the feeding habits of prairie ants. Ants used to be considered predators, meat eaters of invertebrate flesh for the most part, with a bit of a sweet tooth. And in nature, that would be mostly honeydew and extrafloral nectar. But, and I'll define what honeydew is later if you're not sure. But of course, in the modern world, people sometimes walk in prairies and spill crumbs of their sweet food, and the ants will find that and take advantage of it. The dominant prairie species, like the Formica montana, with those dense mounds like we saw before, are better described as sweet tooths with a taste for meat. So those ants are spending a lot of time on plants, either directly visiting nectar glands, usually outside the flowers on those plants, or tending and defending aphids and plant hoppers, which excrete honeydew. So honeydew actually is a waste product. And this is something I think some humans would probably love to have. They have a shunt system in their digestive tract, which allows them to extract carbohydrates and send them to the outside in a watery waste product called honeydew. And so if you think about that, if you could just eat whatever carb-rich food you wanted to, and then just extract the get rid of the carbs with the calories without absorbing them, but taking advantage of the taste, that might be a good thing. Well, the thing about these plant feeding insects, the aphids and plant hoppers, is they eat sap. the plant sap, which is rich in sugar, but the plant hoppers are trying to concentrate the minerals and the protein and so on that are in the sap, and don't need all that sugar, especially since they basically don't move much. So they're not expending a lot of energy. So that's the story of honeydew. And if there's a question about that later, we can clarify that. So we're talking about dominant ants, which is usually some larger ant that spends a lot of time on plants defending aphids and plant hoppers. Non-dominant ants are often smaller species that are omnivores or mass recruiting species, like those little black ants we talked about earlier on. They'll come in sometimes by the hundreds to a crushed grasshopper on a trail or something like that, where a mower might have run over it. And a few eat seeds. They're granivores. So that's the sort of broad outline of the feeding of really all ants. And I'll show you some pictures of specialist predators later on, because they're kind of interesting. There we are. So Diane Davidson at the University of Utah kind of studied canopy ants in tropical forests. And one of the things she noticed is that there were certain individual species were highly abundant in these forests. And others were kind of lurking around, trying to stay out of the way of this dominant species up there in the tree canopy. And these dominant species, like Formica montana in the prairie, are up there feeding on plant and sap-feeding insect exudates. So this is this was kind of a big revelation at the time, and it was the beginning of the end of the ants being predators with a sweet tooth, as opposed to sweet tooths with opportunistic predation. Next. So nearly all ants do prey on something opportunistically, and as I mentioned, that's usually soft-bodied prey. A few are specialist predators, and I'll show you some pictures of those, as I mentioned. And most of these specialized predators among ants generally, the 15,000 species of ants in the world are tropical. But it seems like we've got one or two outliers of these tropical groups right here living in the prairie, especially in the unglaciated prairie. And that makes for enrichment of the fauna. A few ants raid nests of other ants for food, and some raid other ants to gain a workforce. And I'll say more about that a little bit later. Next. Okay, so here's one of a weird little specialists. This is a highly magnified picture. These ants are about 2 millimeters long. And they are specialists on catching springtails, which are these tiny little insects that live in soil and leaf litter and rotting wood and so on. They have, it's a little hard to see this, but if you look right at the front of the end of the hat, they have these long sort of ice tongue-like mandibles, which have a snapping mechanism. And they sneak up on these springtails and snap those mandibles onto them, and the springtails are killed almost instantly. Did I mention these are only about 2 millimeters long? They're tiny. So, and they're hard to see because this color makes them blend in with soil colors pretty well, especially since they have they will sometimes play dead when they're disturbed or exposed to the light. So this is an interesting thing. There are about 900 species of Strumigenys in the world. There's probably 2 or 3 that live regularly in the glaciated prairie that might be found there, although they actually prefer the woods, and somewhat more than that in the unglaciated in the southern prairies. And we're kind of lucky in Missouri, we have both of those. We have, because glaciers didn't cover the whole state. Next. And this is one that does occur in the glaciated prairie and in the woods and in just a lot of places. It might even be in your backyard, although they're pretty rare in the human habitat. They seem to. Anyway, this is another one with the fancy mandibles. These things are long, and they have a dangerous prey, the centipedes. And occasionally they'll eat other things that look superficially like centipedes, such as a beetle larva, mealworm looking things. But for the most part, they're eating centipedes. And centipedes are ferocious predators, and they're pretty dangerous. But these ants sneak up on them. They grab them, and they have a very long stinger, which they are expert at placing right near the nervous system of the centipede, and they inject that venom, and the centipede dies rather quickly, or becomes paralyzed in any case with this venom. Now this ant's a little bit bigger. This one is about 5 millimeters long. You could actually see this one pretty well if they weren't so cryptic, but they're always hidden underground and pretty hard to see. And again, colored, sort of soil colored, so it's a little bit hard to see them. But this is another one. And again, this is a group that's pretty rich. There's several dozen species in the tropics. We have just one in the prairie region. Next. Now this is kind of interesting. Here's another one we only have a couple of a tropical group. These are army ants. And this was actually a picture I took right on a sidewalk at Shaw Nature Reserve one fall day. Mostly they forage at night, and they specialize on raiding the nests of other species of ants to gather their larvae and pupae and prey on them. But in the early parts of the growing season and the very end of it, they sometimes come up during the daytime. So I was fortunate to get a picture of them on the move, moving in a tight little trail, kind of like army ants do. They're completely blind. They depend on their sense of touch and smell to get around, but they're really good at it. And they do. So this obviously is an outbound column. They're not carrying any food, but if they were coming back, you would see them carrying the brood, but not their own brood, the brood of other ants. So army ants also occur in the prairie region, but just a couple species, but they're moderately common. Next. Of course, this is not a specialized predator. This is a different Formica species, not one that we have. This is one in the glaciated prairies to the north of Missouri. They don't even make it into Missouri, but I see them in places like Wisconsin and Minnesota and so on. Anyway, they here are cooperating in transporting a caterpillar that they may have killed, although it looks like it's already kind of dried out a little bit. So that makes me wonder if it was one they scavenged and two of them happened upon it together. But anyway, caterpillar, soft-bodied prey. You're detecting the theme here. Next, please. And here are some of my favorite ants. But they have a sort of an unsavory way of making a living. These red ones here go out on pretty fantastic late afternoon raids. It tends to correspond to supper time or happy hour or something like that. So you have to kind of be really a diehard ant watcher to get out there and watch them. But I have watched literally hundreds of raids of these ants, and finally I got so interested in them, and because I had my suspicions we didn't have enough names for the North American species. So I sat down and did a very careful study, and where there were 5 species worldwide, we ended up with 14, and I still think I came up a little bit short in that paper, but that's neither here nor there. But anyway, they go out on these magnificent raids of these pretty conspicuous red ants. They are probably aposematically colored, in other words, morning colors for birds and so on. Don't take me because I'll give you a pretty good bite. And they have, you can kind of see the curved dagger-like mandibles on the front one here. Now, if you look closely here on the lower right, this is a different photograph. The black ant here is the species that they raid from. It's a common mound building ant, not the Montana we saw before, but a close relative. And this is the exclusive host species of these ants. Now, the thing I want to say about this is that they bring home an awful lot of this Formica brood from these raids, and not all of it gets to grow up. So they mostly, these ants that the babies that they steal grow up into their workforce, and but a good number of them might get damaged in transport, or the ants that are already in the nest think they smell a little funny or something, and decide to eat them rather than raise them as stepsisters, if you will. So that when you find a nest of these, I'll just say last thing about them, they are generally the black host workers, the helper ants, outnumber the red ones by about 5 to 1 or more, or a little bit more. So these guys are really good at diminishing the populations of their host on a very local basis around their nests. Next, please. And here we have a notable exception to the general rule that that ants almost, that all ants are somewhat predacious. Here we actually have one species of fungus growing ant that lives in the prairie region, and it even slightly penetrates the glaciated area into southwestern Iowa. These live in highly drained soils, usually sand or deep loess deposits, and they are they gather plant fragments such as fallen flower petals, and probably even more importantly, they gather a lot of caterpillar dung. And they don't eat this directly, they use it as compost to grow a fungus garden. So you see them here standing on their fungus culture. And so these characters invented farming about 30 million years before we even imagined it as human beings. And they're found, I say they're found in unglaciated sand prairies, but they also get a little bit along the Missouri River in particular, they get quite a bit farther north. And and they if you looked at pictures of the tropical leafcutter ants, you might sort of see a similarity here. They are closely related. Next, please. Okay, so there's a lot of scavenging going on in the ant world. Let's go to the next slide and look at start looking at a couple of these. Here's the aforementioned little black ant, the very first slide of that nest construction. And I mentioned that these will recruit in large numbers to available rich food. In this case, this is a paper wasp larva that somehow fell out of its nest, probably due to a bird pecking at the nest. And because birds like to eat wasp larvae too. As you can see, it's a pretty big, juicy prey item. And anyway, these ants will recruit. One will find it and then run home and lay out a trail, and then dozens or even hundreds of its nestmates will come and tear this apart. When we do the prairie bio blitzes with MPF, I always get these at the baits that we put out. And it's a very characteristic prairie ant. It's also in places, in many places, it's a backyard ant. Next, please. And here's another little tiny ant. This one's, again, just barely over 2 millimeters long. And it's a scavenger, and it doesn't even bother to visit the honeydew producing insects to get the sweet component of its diet. It gets honeydew that's spilled onto the leaf litter and vegetation below the plants where the aphids are feeding. So if there aren't ants there to lap it up directly from the aphids, they just, squirt it out onto the down below them. And this is an ant that takes advantage of that. And they also take a lot of small insects. Sometimes they'll kill their own prey, but mostly they're out there foraging for small dead arthropods, as well as this spilled honeydew. Next, please. And then a not so small ant that is in fact a pretty good predator in its own right, but they're opportunistic. And here's a picture from Shaw Nature Reserve, not too long after, a nice warm day after a late winter prairie burn. And look, they got roasted earthworm out there. So they've dragged it home, and they will take it down and carve it up for themselves and their young. Next, please. So I mentioned earlier that ants may be engineers of the prairie plant community. And this is kind of, we're getting near the end here of this, because but let's talk about a few of the ways that they do that. So some ants are pollinators, act as pollinators. They're not as good as bees, because for the most part, they're not as hairy and so on. But, and because they don't fly, the pollen dispersal is fairly limited in scope. So basically they have to climb down and climb up the next plant, and if the plants are lucky, some pollen gets transferred. Some plants, ants rather, do gather and disperse seeds. They may gather them to eat, although that tends to be more common in dry regions, deserts and so on. And in prairies, you don't see a lot of, there are no specialist seed eaters. There are opportunistics. But there are some seeds that trick ants into moving them around, and I'll show you a slide of that in a minute. Now, this is important. I keep talking about ants visiting the aphids and plant hoppers. And when they visit them, they fend off little parasitic wasps and predators of the aphids and the baby plant hoppers. And this protection actually allows the populations of those species to increase larger number of individuals than they would be if the ants weren't there protecting them. And finally, ants do also defend plants that have extrafloral nectary. So this is nectar that's secreted on a little gland on the leaf petiole or on the flower bud, not nectar that's up in the flower itself. Not most ants don't gather floral nectar as a regular thing. It happens, but it's not the common way. Okay, next. Okay, so here's an ant with some pollen stuck all over its underside, as you can see. And this ant is a fast runner, and it can move among plants. And usually when you see ants doing this, they're on these plants that have dense clusters of small flowers all close together. So that'd be things like yarrow or some of the plants in the parsley carrot family or whatever. Next. And this is an interesting situation here. This is a species of Phaedoli, or so-called big-headed ants, because they have two different size workers that are also differently shaped. So the majority, probably 9 out of 10 of the workers or more, are these sort of regular looking ants. And then on the right-hand side here, you see this big-headed character and that head is full of muscles. And those can be used in a couple different ways. Some species of Phaedoli are specialized on seed gathering, and the big guys crack the seeds. Others are predators, and especially when the little ones find something that's too big to carry home, they recruit not only a whole bunch of their smaller nestmates, but some of these big guys to help cut through basically cut open the prey so that the little ones can then divide it up into smaller pieces that they can carry home. And so there's a lot of, they're predators. This is the largest known genus of ants. There are well over 1,000 species worldwide that have names, and that may be only about half of the actual number there are in the world. So big group, but in prairies, we tend to have only a few species because it's essentially a warm climate and tropical ant group. Next, please. And I mentioned that some plants trick ants into visiting them and their seeds and moving them. And this little thing that looks like a little white worm attached to the seed is not that. It's actually a part of the seed. It's full of nutritious oils and starch and protein. And it's pretty good food for the ants. So these guys actually, these are odorous house ants, as they call them, but they actually originated in the wild, not in houses. And it is a native species found in prairies. And but they're kind of too small to transport these big, heavy seeds. But other species that are a little bit bigger, you know, the 4 millimeter long ones, will find these and they'll pick them up and run home with them. And when they get there, they eat off the nutritious white thing and they discard the hard-coated seed, often underground or under, you know, litter, plant litter that's on the ground or something like that. And this has the dual effect of moving seeds away from their parent plant and placing them in a situation where they can germinate and grow. So pretty cool trick to get the ants to move them around. Next, please. Okay, and just a few comments about the homopteran tending. We've already talked about how when they're tending aphids and plant hoppers and scale insects, the ants are protecting them and actually allowing their populations to grow larger. than they would without ant protection. Honeydew is sugar rich and it has other useful things, and the ants visit the honeydew secreting insects. They are, when they do this, they're in effect drinking a large amount of plant sap. So the sap is a physiological product of plants. It's how they, it's reflective of their sugar metabolism, which they make from scratch, from carbon dioxide and water, basically. And that's the wonderful trick that plants do through photosynthesis. Now, when aphids and plant hoppers feed on plants, there's usually, they have tiny little mouth parts that they suck the sap out of the plant with. And they don't do a lot of tissue damage. And the ants, in fact, probably reduce overall tissue damage on these plants by being there and defending their honeydew secreting friends, and because they bite insect eggs and caterpillars and they chase away leaf-eating beetles and stuff like that. So this is kind of a complex interaction. This is what's called a diffuse mutualism, which involves multiple species of ants, multiple species of sap-feeding insects, and multiple species of plants. And there are very few specialists in this, although there's some in the tropics, but we don't have any in our area. Next, please. So just a few pictures of this kind of activity. Here's some prairie ants, the ones that build the big mounds that we looked at in the earlier slide. They're up on the stem. They're getting honeydew from this plant. And notice the one on the lower right has its mandibles wide open, basically because it doesn't like the photographer being there. And it's saying, you leave my aphids alone. Kind of it's clearly a defensive movement. The others, however, have their mouths, their mandibles closed and their other mouth parts right down there near the aphids where they can lap up the honey, which they get directly from the, as it's excreted by the aphids. Next. And I keep talking about plant hoppers. This is a membracid plant hopper. And the young of these look really weird. They're all spiky looking. The adult is on the lower left there. It's got fully developed wings, which cover all that abdominal armature up. But here's another prairie ant. This one builds gigantic mounds. And you see them in the glaciated prairie. So just wanted to show you what the plant hoppers look like. Next, please. So ants also get nutrients from extrafloral nectaries. These are nectaries, remember, that are outside of the flowers. That's what extrafloral means. And they do protect the plants that have extrafloral nectar. They gain a nutritional benefit themselves from eating this nectar. They get their primary important energy source. On the other hand, when the plants are water stressed, well, they can shut down the nectar production, but if they are unable to do that, the ants may be causing some water stress in those plants, especially in drought conditions. Next, please. Okay, so here, this is a prairie plant called partridge pea. It's got little glands. You can see on the left-hand photo in particular, there's a little round dish-shaped thing that the ant is visiting. And on the right-hand side, you can see that sort of lower center, there's one of them. They're right at the base of the leaf stalk. And this is a really fun picture of one of the prairie ants called Formica difficilis. you might notice that there's a lot of species of Formica in the prairie. Anyway, here's one attacking a Japanese beetle. So you would probably love to have these in your yard if you have Japanese beetle issues. But the trouble is there's got to be extrafloral nectaries or an aphid colony or something there too to attract the ants. Next. Okay, and we're nearing the end here. I'm subterranean ants. I just wanted to mention there's a cadre of subterranean species that you usually don't see unless you actually make a point of excavating for them, or if you lay out cover objects like flat stones, sometimes they'll come up right under them. These can be found in a lot of prairie soil if you look for them. And they are and most of them are dependent on subterranean root-feeding aphids for their nutrition. And I should say, it's not just the aphids alone. They have specialized bacteria in their guts that fix nitrogen for them and combine that with the products they get out of the aphids, which are pretty sugary, and then you end up with the needs of life for an animal. So many of these are quite closely symbiotic with their aphids. They harbor their eggs over the winter in their nests and guard them, and the aphid eggs I'm talking about, not their own, or in addition to their own. So that's the story there. I've got a couple pictures of them. Next. Here's a good sample of the appropriately named Laseat aphidicola. Aphidicola translates from Latin as aphid tending. And if you look at this picture, you can see a little droplet of honeydew coming out of the rear end of each of the aphids. Now, normally they wouldn't all be excreting this at once, but when I lifted the cover object that exposed them, that led to a stress activity. And here's another picture of them harboring the immature aphids, not on roots, but just in their brood chambers, right in there with them through the winter under a rock. Actually, this was in early spring. I found them before they'd been dispersed out to the roots. Next, please. So, just a quick summary. Prairie ants mix and enrich soil. We saw that. Ants are ecosystem engineers, the way they move the soil around, and also because of the effects they have on plant dominance and seed dispersal and plant health overall when they're tending those aphids and so on. And finally, dominant prairie ants are mainly honeydew eaters, and because they're so dominant and abundant, they really do influence plant health, as I say here, for good and ill, depending on a variety of conditions. And that, I think, might be the end. Next. Just some references. We don't have to spend time on those. How about we open it up to questions, Carol?
Thank you very much, James. I just need to get to where I can get to the questions. My name is Carol David. I'm the Executive Director of the Missouri Prairie Foundation. And James, thank you so much for presenting. I know that the information that you shared is really the tip of the iceberg. And we do have a number of questions here. And I'll just go through these as many as I can. Yes, we were having some technical difficulties, so our video is off just to help with the internet speed. So here's some questions about, there's James, yay, great.
Hello.
Here's a question, how do ants make their nest debris so granular looking?
That's a good question. Well, they with their mandibles, they scrape, and their front feet and some other little things on the underside of their head, they can consolidate they'll, first of all, I should say, they scrape the soil particles and then they pack them together into those little pellets. So that's what gives the granular appearance. And I mentioned earlier that sometimes you can tell what ant is in the nest by the array of those pellets of soil that they make. But not only that, the size is characteristic for different ants, which kind of makes sense.
Thanks. On the you have the photo of the dramatic mounds of the ant mounds on Dunn Ranch Prairie, and you said they were 10 feet apart. Is the size of the mound indicative of the age of the mound?
Well, I think there is a sort of a maximum size that they will reach, and that some of these mounds may be inhabited for a really long time. So you really can't, once they reach that large full size, you can't really tell how old it is, because it might be 100 years old, you know, and constantly re-inhabited or adding population. One thing that those ants do is they adopt queens after the mating flights, the mated queens, and so they end up just essentially being perennial colonies.
Thank you.
So you can, yeah.
Question: Are Formica montana endemic to glaciated prairie?
Ah, good question. Yes, they are. And so is that Formica exectoides, the one I showed with the plant hoppers, and several others.
A couple questions about the army ants. Are the army ants in glaciated or unglaciated prairies, or both?
They're primarily found in unglaciated prairies, which you might expect since they're outliers of a tropical group of insects. But again, in the Loess Hills of southwestern Iowa, they can be found along with in the same places where those outlier fungus growers are.
Thank you. Are all army ants blind, or only the one species that you shared?
As far as I know, all of them are blind in terms of the ability to form an image, and that their eyes are just too rudimentary for them to be have vision. Now they are light sensitive; they can detect light. And I would just add that the males, which are the dispersing form of army ants, they fly out and find other colonies of army ants to mate with the young queens that are raised there, who have no wings of their own. The males can see fine. They have big eyes, and they fly out, they see where they're going, and they're even attracted to lights.
Question: Is it possible to identify ant species just by looking at them?
Yes, it is, with practice. I do it a lot. But it takes some training.
Question: Why is there such a lack of ant diversity in our yards / coming into our kitchens? I guess what the question is when we do see ants in our kitchens, they tend to be maybe one or two different species. I'm guessing is what she means.
Right. Yeah, I see. I get that. Well, our kitchens are not good or natural habitat for ants. Now, if you lived in the tropics, as is generally the case with so many different life forms, kitchen and house ants are a little bit more diverse than they are in our region. But we just have a few native species that inhabit the human habitat anyway. It was mentioned earlier that there's about 150 species of ants in Missouri. Probably 24 of them will be found in backyards, and that's in backyards that are, you know, have some sort of untended spaces where the leaf litter is allowed to accumulate under the trees, and maybe, a chemical lawn that's not going to have very many ants in it. So first of all, the human habitat has a reduced species diversity, and then our buildings are just not very good habitat for them, so not many actually come in. Somebody's probably thinking, well, what about carpenter ants? And fact of the matter is, carpenter ants, which are not found in prairies for the most part, with one exception, are they're a symptom, not the problem. And by that I mean they inhabit wood that is already softened by some degree of fungal decomposition. So wood that has gotten wet and starts to decompose and soften, that can be inhabited by carpenter ants. And basically, carpenter ants are telling you got some bad wood that needs replacing.
Thank you. There's so many interesting questions. Trying to get through as many as we can. Here's a question. If I have a large amount of aphids on my milkweeds, is this more detrimental to the plant or beneficial to ants?
Well, like I say, it's complicated. It sort of depends on the overall health of the milkweeds and so on. Now, of course, some people like to wash off the aphids off their milkweeds to leave the plants a little bit more able to feed monarch caterpillars, which are sort of the prized insect of the day. But oh, and another thing I just mentioned is that the yellow aphids with black legs that we see so often on milkweeds are actually not a native species. They're an invasive species. There are native milkweed aphids, and they tend to have a much lower impact on the plants. Fancy that, huh? They're sort of co-adapted with the milkweeds and the ants and so on. They're just part of that diffuse mutualism I mentioned before. But the oleander aphid is a species from the Mediterranean region and North Africa, which has adapted to feeding on milkweeds, even though there aren't milkweeds native in that part of the world. Notwithstanding the fact that our common milkweed is called Asclepias syriaca, which means the Syrian milkweed. But there's a story to that, which I won't go into right now.
We have a couple questions about invasive ants. Could you speak briefly about invasive plants on prairies? And then kind of a companion question, is there any instance of invasive species like Solenopsis invicta or the Argentine crazy ant showing up in prairies?
Yeah, I just point out Argentine and crazy ants are two different things, but anyway, that's fine. You can put them together in your mind a little bit. They kind of look alike. Fire ants actually do colonize prairies to the south of Missouri. We don't really have them here yet because fortunately we have cold enough winters to just keep them from thriving. But they do, for example, the Texas coastal prairies in the Houston area, they're just crawling with carpenter ants. The little prairie remnants in the black soil, blackland prairies in northern Mississippi and so on, they can have fire ants. Sometimes integrated in with the ant fauna, not being totally destructive to it. So that's the story on invasive non-native ants in prairies. What I would say about invasive ants in a more general way is a lot of them are highly disturbance tolerant and can live very well in the human habitat because it's messed up basically relative to pristine nature. So and here in Missouri cities we have the Asian pavement ant. This is an ant that really likes cities and often, nests under sidewalks and the edges of roads and so on. And and I'm very angry with them because when I first moved into my house about 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, there were about 24 species of ants, basically the full gamut of the human habitat ants. And now about half of them remain, and in lower numbers, because the Asian pavement ants came in with a load of rock, put on a spire gas line nearby, and this is how it works. These creatures are very opportunistic. They move in soil and rock, and they can take over and displace the natives.
Thank you. Why do ants differentiate between glaciated versus unglaciated prairies? And for those who might not be familiar, in Missouri, glaciated prairies would begin pretty much north of the Missouri River, and then the unglaciated would be south of the Missouri River, just to give people a general idea if they're unfamiliar.
Right. Well, it's historical, for one thing. At one time, the glaciers pushed a whole lot of the life that lived farther north to the south for the duration of that ice cover. And so those ants and plants and grasshoppers and a whole lot of other things, butterflies, that are found only in the glaciated prairies, were hanging on there at the edge of the glaciers down in the deep, what we now think of as the deep south. Well, as the glaciers melted away and retreated, those were the things that colonized the prairies that formed after the retreat of the glaciers. The other thing is that there's different climate conditions. There are different soil types, and which we know are kind of important for ants, and different plants as well. So the ants are, it's not really a surprise that that with their different histories and with all the other associated species, that the ants are different. There is overlap, by the way. There's some species that occupy both glaciated and unglaciated prairies, but there are some that are specialists, occur in one or the other type of prairie exclusively.
Thank you. Several more questions about the relationships between ants and plants. And of course, you showed the image of the ants that get nectar from the extrafloral nectaries, those glands that are outside of flowers and might be, near leaves or near the leaf axis. And then you also showed a photo of an ant actually on the top of a flower cluster. When they're on the flower clusters, are they collecting and eating both nectar and pollen, or does it depend?
Most ants don't eat pollen. There are some that have been demonstrated to eat pollen, but usually they just kind of clean it off their bodies and drop it. So it kind of goes to waste. There are some arboreal ants in the tropics that do have, for which pollen's an important component of their diet.
Thank you.
But,
and a couple questions about wild ginger and ants and the seeds. And
yeah.
I think you were saying it's the case that a number of seeds have those elaiosomes, that nutritious worm-like structure, and they're gathering the seeds to eat that, but they don't actually eat the seeds. Is that correct? And would that be correct for violets and wild ginger?
Yes, violets, wild ginger, prairie trout lily, and some sedges actually have an edible body, non-reproductive attachment on their seeds, on their grains, really, and those are harvested and dispersed by ants too.
Do you know what species of sedge that is?
It's the ones with the spongy bases, of which there are many. So.
Okay, thank you. That was another question. When you were saying in one of the last slides that the ants, quote, nurture young aphids over winter in their underground nests and, quote, place the aphids back out onto the plant stems in the spring. Yes. Is that what you were saying?
That is. Yes.
Okay, great.
So this is characteristic of not only Lasius aphidicola, but a whole lot of its relatives in that same genus. And there are other ants that do that too.
what's the biggest predators of ants?
Well, things like baby quail will eat them. You know, a lot of lizards really like them. Skinks and prairie lizards or fence lizards. They eat a lot of ants. We don't have any specialist predators of ants and I should say spiders too. But we don't have any specialist predators of ants for the most part, except possibly a few of the spiders that sort of hang around ant nest entrances and eat essentially only ants.
I have a couple questions about ants and herbicides. Do herbicides negatively impact ants? Do you see fewer ants in soil where herbicides have been used? And just as a refresher, so when we talk about herbicides, we're talking about a chemical that is designed to kill plants. So that's what we mean by herbicide.
Right. Well, herbicides are at least mildly toxic to animals as well as to plants. I mean, you shouldn't be drinking Roundup, but and some of the others are a little worse than that. So this said, the real effects of herbicides on ants are indirect. Those are the important ones, because ants interact so many ways with plants and with the sap-feeding insects that live on the plants. That's where the real impact. Now, has it been measured or closely studied? Well, not very carefully in the prairie system, but it's there has been some work done in the grasslands in Europe, the meadows, mountain meadows, and so on. I'll tell you what's even worse or at least a significant factor in reducing ant diversity in native grasslands is fertilization. And you know, in Switzerland, for example, or Sweden, the native grasslands there are pretty rich ant habitat. But you know, if they feed them nitrogen, or if acid rain deposits nitrogen inadvertently on these systems, the plant communities are impacted. They tend to get taken over by fescue and other, you know, aggressive grasses, and the ants decline.
Thank you. If you're game, James, we still have a number of questions, and we still have 155 people on, so there's still a lot of great questions. Yep. Are there any studies that focus on wildfire effects on ants?
There have been some studies, a fair number of studies of fire and ants. And they do, fires, of course, depends on the severity a lot. And some ants that build mounds composed of with a lot of plant matter, dry twigs and leaves and things like that. And there are some in the prairie that do that. Their nests can be destroyed by fire. Of course, the fires typically occur during the dormant season, so the ants aren't up in the above ground part of the nest. They're down deeper in the soil where fire doesn't penetrate. But yeah, there's a difference in which ants are favored during this, at least a season or two following a burn, as opposed to places that haven't been burned in a while. So it's, yeah, there are impacts. And there's a few papers out there on it. It's hard to generalize about it without going into a bunch of species names, though.
Okay.
But I'd add that just associated with those species are different functional groups. In other words, you know, like in plants, we have nitrogen fixers, and we have grass-like plants, and we have non-nitrogen fixing forbs, and we have shrubs and subshrubs and all that stuff. Well, in ants, there are functional groups that are sort of analogous to those groups in plants, based on their foraging and their interactions with other organisms around them.
Thank you. Why do peonies and daylilies always have a plethora of ants on them? I was told many years ago that the peonies needed them to open the blossoms.
That is not literally true, although it helps to have the ants there because they defend those buds from things that might lay eggs in them and damage the flower forming within. But the ants are attracted to extrafloral nectaries. They're microscopic nectar secreting glands on those buds, and the ants are attracted to those. So that's why you have a plethora.
Thank you. Are ants indicative of soil health?
Ants are very, ant diversity and the species composition are pretty closely tied to soil conditions. So the simple answer to that question is yes.
Are ant species and populations increasing or decreasing generally? If ants ceased to exist, what would be the main consequences?
Oh boy. Okay. Well, that was a two-part question. Ants, I would say ecologically fussy or species are definitely on decline because of habitat destruction. Those that can tolerate what we do to the environment are doing okay, maybe even have increased. I'm sorry, what was the second part? Remind me.
What would be the main consequences if they cease to exist?
Yeah, well, all the ways that I've talked about in terms of the roles of ants in nature, their predation, their relationships with plants and with other insects, those things would certainly be diminished. And so you could say that there would be, if you think of the balance of nature as a structure, I don't know, or an automobile or something like that, it would be a serious dent in the body to eliminate ants. And the reason I say that is because ants are extremely abundant in the world. Their biomass, the biomass of ants on the planet is roughly equal to that of the human population. And you can imagine with 8 billion of us, we weigh a lot. So that's about how much the ants of the world collectively weigh. It's an important impact.
Thank you. Is the information that you gave about prairie ants similar for woodland ants in terms of types, mounds, tunnels, etc.?
Yeah, but with different details and different proportions. Woodland ants, of course, have, there's arboreal things. I didn't really mention this, but almost all prairie ants nest in soil, whereas in the woods, there's a bunch of them that nest in rotten logs or in the hollows of twigs or up in the trees. And we don't see that in prairies, obviously. So it differs in details, but the sort of the general picture is the general tendencies are about the same.
Thank you. Why would an ant who was robbed from another nest stay with the group of ants that robbed them?
Aha. Well, it's sort of like, I called them kidnapper ants. And a baby who is taken, a human baby who is taken from its parents and ends up growing with somebody else may have no memory of where it came from. So, until it's explained to it. But anyway, the immature ants have not imprinted on a colony, on a parent colony collective odor profile. They literally don't know that they've grown up somewhere other than where they were born. So they just, and the thing is that's really crazy about it is that, they're not just there with their own genetic sisters, but with hundreds of other workers of their same species, but who originated from different parent colony. So These colonies are a real gamish of genes and individual genetic, of genetic makeup. So especially the host population is highly diverse because it's basically sampled from the whole surrounding population of the ones that are raided. Now the kidnapper ant colonies just have one queen, and as far as we know, they mate only once, so they're pretty genetically uniform within those colonies.
Thank you. What prairie plants host the aphids and plant hoppers that the ants use?
Oh boy. Well, we already mentioned milkweeds, which have both some native and non-native aphids on them. But there are other things too. Thistles are pretty important. Ironweeds. The underground aphids, I don't really know what their preferred routes are, but they live on, they're somewhat specialized. So yeah, that's about the answer. I need to get a little water in my cup so I can carry on answering a few more questions. It'll take me 10 seconds.
Okay, very good. And I'll just, while you're doing that, James, I'll just tell folks who are on that Brooke will be sending a link to the recording tomorrow, as well as some links to some articles that may be of interest. I was going to mention also that we do have an article in the Missouri Prairie Journal from a few years ago. That's an interview with a plant hopper specialist who has done some work on prairies, so that may be of interest. And James, in regard to the question that we had there, there are plant hoppers that have specific host plants. Is that correct?
There are, although the common ones that are most visited by ants are a little bit more generalist. They might go to a wide variety of, say, daisy family species, or or some other, or they like penstemons or whatever. But yeah, there is definitely plant specialization among the sap feeders.
Great. Just a few more questions here. A granivore or granivore that you mentioned before, that's one that is eating grains or carrying them?
Right. And I mentioned the Phaedoli, the big-headed ones. Those soldiers or major workers are able to actually crack the hulls of seeds, and then the little ones go about dissecting up the starchy, soft innards of those seeds and feeding them to their young. So yes, that's how they eat seeds.
So some do eat seeds, but then other ants, for example, the ones that are carrying the trout lily seeds, they're not eating those seeds, they're just eating the iliosome. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Margot says, wonderful photos. Are there any honeypot ants, the Myrmecocystis in the US?
Myrmecocystis, yeah, those are North American. They live, the closest ones to here are in western Kansas. We don't have them in Missouri. They live in drier, more arid climates, but they're abundant in the west, in the shrublands and grassland, desert grasslands. And then they go on down into Mexico, and basically, as soon as you get to the humid tropics, they drop out. So they're specialist North American arid land species. There's about 30 of them. Some quite rare, but others common.
Thank you. I don't know if you can explain this very quickly, but a request to please tell us again about the symbiotic relationship of subterranean ants combining nitrogen and honeydew.
Oh yeah. Well, this is kind of an area of research that's kind of blossoming lately. It's about the microbiome of ants. So ants have a variety of usually bacteria, sometimes on the outsides of their bodies, but especially well studied are those that live within their digestive tracts. And these bacteria are able to take atmospheric nitrogen from dissolved in the body fluids of the ants from their breathing, basically, and turn it to amino acids in combination with the sugars and such that are brought in from the ants feeding outside. And there are, these are metabolically important for the ants. Some ants just have naturally very low protein diets. And if they didn't have those bacteria in there helping them fix nitrogen, they'd be starving.
Thank you. Question, I have noticed at times in my yard that it appears the ants have died outside on top of their nest. Was this a raided nest?
Probably you've got Asian pavement ants, and they have territorial battles that result in fairly high levels of mortality. And they end up with big bone piles on the surface, if you will.
Is there a typical winter survival strategy for ants?
Yes. Fatten up in fall, dig in to a safe place in the soil and place that you're not going to experience a lot of variation in temperature through the cold period. And though some ants are quite cold tolerant, some can undergo sub-freezing temperatures and they're fine. Carpenter ants are especially good at that. Of course, they're above ground in dead wood of trees or whatever. But anyway, basically it's fatten up in fall and find a good place to cluster together and just not do anything for a few months.
Thank you.
I'd like to do that in the winter myself, by the way.
Val says, I have done an exercise with children where we put food choices on paper plates and place them outside for 30 minutes or so and predict where the most ants would be found. It is always on hamburger rather than jelly or baked goods. Is this showing preference for meat or carrion as primary rather than sweets? Are these non-prairie species?
No, that's kind of a general tendency of ants in the early part of the warmer months, the spring and early summer. And the reason for that is that's when they do their peak brood rearing. They're raising the next population of workers and possibly the winged reproductives as well. They need a lot more protein for that. If you did this, I don't know what time of year you did this, but there's definitely a tendency as you go through the summer and into the fall for the protein baits to become way less attractive. And they're, again, I talked about them wanting to put on weight in the fall. They tend to, well, for one thing, they forage less anyway because they're sort of slowing down and their brood doesn't need a lot of food because it's all grown up. And but they do shift over to a more carbohydrate-rich, sugar-rich diet towards the end of summer.
All right, last three questions. Is it possible to scare away or remove the ants before making a plaster cast like that, or was the colony sacrificed for the display?
The colonies were sacrificed, and in fact, you couldn't even retrieve specimens for study. So a few would have to be collected beforehand to do the identification. Walter has done some casts with wax, and that was actually, these were done as part of scientific study, both not just the description of the nest structure, but also where the different ants of different ages and the brood and the queen and everybody are within that nest structure. So the advantage of using the wax casts is that you could actually see where everybody was. And because you can broadly tell I mean, you could tell the different castes apart, the different body forms and so on. But the brood is clearly distinctive because ants are like butterflies, have egg, larva, and a pupa and adult. And yeah, so, but the short answer is yes, they are sacrificed in this case by this kind of sampling.
Thank you. Do you have a recommendation of a book or other resource for beginning to learn about ants?
Oh boy, beginning, probably, you know, for an educated reader, you know, somebody who's a good reader, not necessarily even college educated, although that might help just because of the breadth of reading that one does in that part of your education. There's a book by the authors of the standard text, the academic text, called Journey to the Ants. This is by Bert Holdobler and Edward O. Wilson. And it's also kind of autobiographical, that talks about how they became interested in ants as children and so on. So that's kind of a nice starter point for an adult, or even, you know, really interested high school or possibly even middle school, you know, someone who's a good reader.
Thank you. And we'll look that up and put that in the email tomorrow. Last question. How did you get interested in ants?
Well, almost as long as I can remember, I have been interested. I can tell you an event that happened when I was 6 years old. We had recently moved from Washington, D.C. to Buffalo, New York, and had a relatively large backyard in Buffalo. And one late summer day, there was a mating flight of what are known as the Labor Day ants, because they fly right around the end of summer in early September. These ants were pouring out of the nest. There were two different sizes of ants and two different sizes and colors of ants that had wings. And then there were the regular wingless worker ants. And I asked my older brother what was going on there, because I was just fascinated by all of these, you know, different forms of ants pouring out into the daylight from this common nest entrance. And then, lo and behold, the winged ones all started flying away, and the air became full of ants. And I didn't realize it at the time, but there was mating going on among the winged ones from different colonies. And anyway, I still remember that to this day, that emergence of the ants on a warm afternoon in early September in Buffalo, New York. We have the same species here in eastern Missouri too, by the way. But yeah, that sort of was the trigger for a lifelong interest.
Well, James, thank you. Even with all of these questions and answers, I know it's still scratching the surface of this incredible topic. And James has been so generous to give us time at past Missouri Prairie Foundation Prairie Bio Blitzes and had actual ant field study groups. We couldn't do that last year because of the pandemic. We're still not sure what we'll be able to do this growing season, but hope very much in the future that James can get back out on our prairies, and hopefully many of you can join him. So do watch our Missouri Prairie Foundation website for upcoming events like that. We do have a number of small group guided hikes coming up this growing season with different leaders. We have more webinars and master classes coming up this spring on so far every Wednesday. And so please check there and watch your email tomorrow for a link to the recording of James's wonderful presentation. And thank you all very much for tuning in today. And thank you, James, for being so generous with your time and expertise.
And thank you all for being attentive and interested. I love those questions. They're a great batch of questions. So.
Well, good night, all 99 people who are still with us. So thank you so much, everybody. Bye-bye. Thank you, James.
You're welcome. See you soon.
Bye-bye.